Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Jeff, and you're listening to episode 12 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hello. Today's comic is one that I definitely wish I could close my eyes and remember the exact moment that I got my hands on this comic book. Today's comic book of the day is Star Wars #1. July 1977 from Marvel Comics Group. So knowing that the publication date was July of 1977, that means that we can back out to June, May, April, knowing that this was probably on the newsstands in your local drugstore, supermarket, comic book spinner rack, probably around April of 1977, okay? The movie debuted nationally on May 25th, 1977, end of May, became probably the cultural phenomena that it's now known as sometime around the first week of June or so. It opened small in May. It looks like it opened in about 32 theaters on May 25th. So it opened in much wider release, a week or two later down the line, and just took off like the rocket that we know that it is, no pun intended. So this comic book actually was released from an adaptation of the story by George Lucas. And apparently, from what I understand, I think Lucas handpicked Howard Chaykin personally, or at least had a hand in Howard Chaykin being the person who was chosen to illustrate this particular issue, or this particular series, series 1 through 6. This one is interesting. So at the time, I believe or so it goes, and this is coming from Sean Howe's Marvel Comics book. If you haven't gotten your hands on The Untold Story of Marvel Comics by Sean Howe, then I would definitely suggest that you do it. And there's a little bit of background on this comic book in the Marvel history, The Untold Story of Marvel Comics, where they talk about the dire financial straits that Marvel Comics was in early or late 76 when this book was brought to Roy Thomas, who was editor at the time at Marvel Comics. Roy was approached by a marketing consultant who told him about this movie that was currently underway, under production in Tunisia, and felt like it would be something that it would be right up Marvel's alley if they would do a comic book adaptation of this story. So the story got into Roy Thomas's hands, and he saw some conceptual art and decided to pass it on to Stan Lee. And apparently at the time, due to the financial situation that Marvel was in, and remember, this is late 76, this is before the Kiss comic, this is around the time Howard the Duck was sort of circling the drain a bit. This was not a good time to be at Marvel Comics. This was Marvel Comics wasn't doing very well at the time, and I think there have probably been several ebbs and flows in terms of Marvel's fortunes and lack thereof. But this was probably closer to one of those times when Marvel was not in good shape. And the thing that sort of played into this comic book's favor was the fact that Marvel was starting to take on licensing properties. If you take a look at the comics around this time that are being put out by Marvel, you'll see things like Logan's Run, 2001: A Space Odyssey. You'll look at licensed properties. Micronauts, I think, came out around, I don't know if Micronauts came out around this time, but you start to see a lot of licensed properties that Marvel is doing. And of course, this is an easy way for them to sort of get a boost. You can, if you're tying yourself into a licensed brand that already has some awareness among people, you don't really have to do a lot of marketing, and there's a general level of awareness. This, however, was not the case with Star Wars. So if we back up a bit and we realize that this comic book actually shipped around April of 1977, you're a good 2 or 3 months into the summer before you're probably, I think, around issue 3 before the movie actually ever came out. And of course, this comic book sold so many copies. It went back into subsequent printings. It was reprinted again. It boosted Marvel's bottom line at a time when they really needed boosting, and this was something that went a long way towards helping to save Marvel. A couple of other things came out at the same time. Like I said, the Kiss magazine, it was the large format sort of magazine Kiss comic that was $1.50 came out, and that sold in record numbers. I think it sold upwards of 500,000 copies, which was unheard of, for a book that was priced at $1.50 at the time. But this comic really helped, really gave Marvel a shot in the arm when they needed it most. The interesting thing about this book too is that this is based on an earlier adaptation of the story. I remember I was 10 years old when when Star Wars came out, and I ate up Star Wars like it was nobody's business. For that Christmas, I had, I believe it was, we were able to get, I don't recall exactly who it was, and I'm sure if I look this up, I can probably find out. And there are those of you out there that probably remember this a lot better than I do, or probably know the story of this a lot more. But around the time that the Star Wars figures were coming out at the holiday season, you actually didn't get the Star Wars figures. You got a voucher to pick up the Star Wars figures. And I remember I had the first, collection of Star Wars figures from that first release of them with Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader with the telescoping lightsabers coming out of the arm. I had the R2-D2 and C-3PO. And this, in hindsight, it's easy to look back on this and say that this was, one of the biggest cultural phenomena of the last 30 or 40 years, just in terms of like science fiction and science fiction movies and movies in general, and how it changed, the landscape of popular culture. But at the time, it really was that big. I collected Star Wars cards. I had Star Wars action figures. I had the novelization of the book, which was an adaptation of the original story, which is what this comic was based on. And therein is probably some of the most interesting pieces of the Star Wars, of this comic. If you're reading this comic, it has scenes from the story or scenes from Star Wars that were originally supposed to be shot in the original script but never made their way into the film. So, for instance, on page 7 of this comic, we have, the interaction between Biggs and Luke Skywalker. So we have an entire scene devoted to Luke Skywalker in Anchorhead on Tatooine, meeting Biggs. Biggs is telling him that, he signed up for the rebellion, Biggs Darklighter. And it's Luke's best friend, and of course Luke is sad that he doesn't get a chance to go off and fight the Empire in the rebellion, and his friends are getting a chance to do it. Alluded to in the movie, but never filmed, or either filmed and never dropped into the movie. But I remember it being in the novelization of the story, and then seeing this scene in the comic book. There's a scene at the end. There was another scene at the end that wasn't included in the movie where Biggs is killed in the battle over the Death Star, and it really has it's an impactful scene when you're reading it in the novelization, and the impact comes from knowing that it's one of Luke's best friends from the earlier scene. So, reading the novelization as a kid, reading the adaptation novelization, however it is, and then reading the Star Wars comic at the time, this was one of those things that really jumped out at me as, the book is richer, and the book has more content than the movie did, and there was stuff that was left out of the movie that was in the original story and that was in the comic that we didn't get a chance to see. So an interesting read. Howard Chaykin does a great job with art here. There's a lot of interesting things. Remember, this was out before the movie was released, so there are some things in here where you get a little bit of what is it, like artistic license, right? So artistic liberty. Darth Vader, drawn slightly different, a little more menacing in the comic book. C-3PO, a little bit more animated, a little bit more, more motion from C-3PO than you actually saw. If you remember, there's that stilted walk of C-3PO, and he doesn't move around a whole lot, probably mostly because the costume is restrictive. But in the comics, he's drawn in a much more dynamic way. And then there's all, the famous front cover where Darth Vader is drawn in, for lack of a better term, green. He's not his black menacing self, and Leia Leia looks a bit tarted up on the cover. I'm not gonna lie, she's a little bit sort of she's a little bit heavy there on the makeup on the front cover. So interesting book, great, interesting in terms of the fact that it kind of, at the time it was a real phenomena separate from the movie. The comic sold a ton. Interesting side story about this book. There is a very, very small distribution subset of this book where Marvel Comics was testing price increases. So the price of this book was 30 cents, but I believe, I want to say Kentucky or Tennessee or a small pocket in the United States got copies of this book with a 35-cent price tag. Really small number of books out there with a 35-cent price tag on them. And of course, that is a much, much sought after variant. In fact, I believe that might be the number one Bronze Age title in the top 10 list of Bronze Age titles. Of course, Bronze Age being from the late 60s, early 70s, probably 1970 up until the black and white era of the 80s. But in terms of value, I believe that Star Wars #1, that 35-cent variant, is far and away the most valuable Bronze Age book that was published during that time period. So there again, I've in going to comic book shows, I think I've maybe possibly run across one or two of them with the 35-cent price tags. Always slabbed, always encased, always graded and slabbed in CGC'd. So I've never seen a raw comic in the wild with a 35-cent price tag on it. Overstreet, the current Overstreet value of this book is #1 in 9.2 near mint, runs for about $200. A 9.0 copy of this goes for about $132. A very fine 8.0 copy will cost you about $64. And then a 6.0 copy will run you about $30. That variant, by the way, if you are lucky enough to be able to find that variant copy, a 9.2 copy of that variant will cost you roughly $7,500 to buy. Here's the deal, and I'm going to read this sort of verbatim from the Overstreet guide. It says, apparently, limited distribution, about 1,500 copies with a question mark. So that's 1,500 copies. Lower distribution than, say, a Cerebus #1, for instance, which had about 2,000 copies its first run. There's a price in the square with the UPC code. Prices vary widely on this book. In 2005, a CGC certified 9.4 sold for $6,500, and a 9.2 sold for $3,400, and a certified 6.0 sold for $610. So there you can see prices vary widely for that 35-cent variant. And if you ever run across that and you are a collector with a lot of money to burn, then get your hands on one of those, because there's only about 1,500 of those in existence. But there you have it. Today's comic book of the day is Star Wars #1 by Marvel Comics Group, July 1977. Head on over to comicbookoftheday.com to take a look at it and see what you think. See what you think of my copy. Give me some notes and let me know what you think the grade is on that copy. Leave a comment if you want. But we are at, again, comicbookoftheday.com. You can also follow us on Facebook if you like. Keep up with us. We post a lot of photos of the books and things like that on Facebook as well, and upload copies of the podcast there. So if you want to listen along on Facebook, we are Comic Book of the Day on Facebook. We are on Twitter at CB of the Day and Instagram at Comic Book of the Day. So hope to run into you, hope to see you. Leave us some comments, leave us some likes, give us some kisses, give us some hugs. And we will see you all tomorrow for another episode of the Comic Book of the Day podcast.